Welcome back for another strategy video related to the board game Clans of Caledonia. This video builds on my first video on the basic strategy for Clans of Caledonia, so if you haven't watched it yet, you can find the link to it in the video description. In this video, we will look at strategy specifically around contracts. The game starts and you see all these contracts on the board and you begin thinking, so which one of these do I want to take? How does one even decide what is a good contract to take? And why do certain contracts always get taken right away on the first turn of the game, but not others? These are the types of questions I will address in this video based on my experiences and observations. Let's start by looking at which contracts are the most popular to take as a first contract using data from the top players on Board Game Arena, or BGA. In order from most popular, on the left, here are the top 5. Next, we look for commonalities across the contracts. We don't know what clans are chosen or what ports and glory tiles are in the game, as these will affect which contracts are considered better. That being said, there are 2 factors that do stand out for these 5 contracts. First, they are all relatively cheap contracts to complete. We will look at how to determine the cost of a contract later, but for now, I can tell you that these 5 contracts are all within the 10 cheapest contracts that exist in the game. Second, 4 out of the 5 return a substantial amount of cash, with 2 also returning a monetary equivalent. As you know from my general strategy video, money is really important, especially at the beginning of the game, and these contracts gave a lot of it relative to the cost of the contract. Now, let's look at the 5 least common contracts chosen in the first round, again, based on data from the top players on BGA. The first 2 have never been chosen by top players in my database of BGA games, and the other 3 have only been chosen once. In fact, in one game, a top player didn't even take a contract in the first round, preferring to forego the £5 of income and wait until the next round to pick up a better contract. So, what's wrong with these contracts? These are some of the most expensive contracts to complete. Only one gives back money, but it is small compared to the cost of completing the contract. What is good about these contracts is that they give many victory points via export goods. That makes these good endgame contracts when points are more valuable than money, but bad beginning game contracts. Now, let's better understand why the cost of the contract and the income generated from completing it are so important to the contract choice. At the beginning of the game, we assume the following costs related to contracts. Goods cost the starting market price, and animals cost the price of the animal plus £1 for the hex cost. There are always exceptions, like Stewart's goods should be priced £1 less, or Robertson's animal should be priced £3 less, but in general, this is directionally correct. The cost of the contract is further reduced by £5 because you receive income for taking the contract in the first round. This last point is extremely important when accounting for the contract cost, especially when you have to pay for contracts in later rounds. The contract cost is one reason why cheap contracts are better early in the game, while expensive contracts are better later in the game. On the benefits side, as has already been described in the basic strategy video, free expansions and upgrades are considered monetary equivalents. Expansions are equivalent to £5 of income, because expansions tend to happen on £5 and £6 hexes, while upgrades are equivalent to £5 of income at the beginning of the game because they tend to be used for technology upgrades. Finally, regarding points, each export good is worth 4 points, which is the average worth for cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. And hops are worth 1 point each. Later in the video, we will see what happens to the value of a contract when the point values for export goods change. So let's use the 1 sheep, 1 cheese contract as an example. 1 sheep costs £9, and 1 cheese costs £10. Subtract £5 for taking the contract, and we get a total cost of £14. £10 of income is returned, along with a free expansion valued at £5 for a total income of £15. In addition, we get 8 points. In round 1, cheap is usually really good, but we can better quantify what good means based on the income generated, remembering that points are not helpful for our production engine early in the game, but money is. We will create a ratio between the income and cost. So for our contract, it is £15 divided by £14 for a ratio of 1.07, with higher being better. Let's look at the top 5 contracts based on the income to cost ratio. Not surprisingly, 2 of the top 3 contracts match the contracts chosen by the top players on BGA. As it turns out, the second and fifth best contracts in this list are also ranked highly by top BGA players at numbers 6 and 7. That begs the question, why isn't the one bread, one cheese, one whiskey contract valued as highly by top BGA players? And a second related question, where are the other 3 top 5 contracts that the top players really like? The answer to the first question may be that the one bread, one cheese, one whiskey contract is relatively expensive to complete, and although it returns wonderful rewards, it is difficult to complete quickly as it requires 3 processed goods. On the other hand, just because a contract is cheap doesn't necessarily make it a great contract in round 1. Take, for example, the one cow, one wool contract. It is the 3rd cheapest contract in the game, but it returns no income. Actually, this contract speaks to the second question very nicely, so let's transition to it. Where are the other 3 top 5 contracts that the top players really like? Well, let's look at them. The biggest situational factor affecting the value of a contract in round 1 are the ports. Of relevance for this discussion is the animal slaughter port, because it drops the cost of the contract significantly for 3 of the 4 in this list. Let's update the cost for the contracts by removing the cost of one animal due to using a port to complete the contract. The 3 animal contracts become simply outstanding. 2 of them even have a negative cost. That leaves the 2 cheese contract. There is one situational factor that makes this contract more valuable, which is if you are playing as Clan McEwen because of the hops. Other than that, there's nothing particularly notable. It is just a cheap contract that returns a nice amount of cash. Now, let's look at the worst 5 contracts for round 1. There are 18 contracts that return no money or equivalents back, so these are basically ordered by the most expensive contracts to complete that have no monetary return. And no surprise here, 4 out of the 5 are also the worst for top players on BGA, with 2 of them never having been chosen by top players at all in my database of BGA games. Now let's have a look at the best contracts at the end of the game in round 5. In round 1, money was a major factor in deciding the cost and benefit of a contract. In round 5, points are more valuable than money, so that affects how the costs and benefits of the contract are calculated. On the cost side, it is still useful to look at the monetary cost like we did in round 1, but now we can also look at the point cost. Regarding monetary cost, to keep things simple and consistent, I will use the same assumptions from the beginning of the game, which are the market price of goods is based on the starting market price, and animals cost the price of the animal plus £1 for the hex cost. In reality, the market prices for goods could be higher or lower than the starting price, and you may not be able to claim a £1 hex for an animal, but like before, these assumptions are directionally correct and are good enough to get the point of this exercise across. Also, the cost of the contract is increased to £15, but reduced by any monetary rewards. The monetary benefits are the same as in round 1, except that upgrades are adjusted to only be £4 of value, since it will likely be a merchant or shipping upgrade and not a technology upgrade. More importantly, we want to pay attention to the points received for completing the contract. With the point cost, the idea is that if you do not use a good, you get points for it at the end of the game. A sheep will produce 1 wool worth 1 point at the end of the game. A cow will produce 1 milk, which ordinarily is only worth 1 point, but it is often used to make cheese, which is worth 2 points, so the cost is 2. Wool is worth 1 point at the end of the game, and the 3 processed goods are all worth 2 points each. To determine the best contracts in round 5, we can look at the ratio of net points to monetary cost. Net points are determined by looking at the export goods and hops, but subtracting out the point cost. Also, the export goods point value has been assumed to be a constant 4 points for each export good to make it easier to compare the contracts, But of course, the point value could be 3 or 5, or there could be glory tiles that affect the values too, like the animal glory. Here are the top contracts without considering situational exceptions. Notice that all of the top 5 contracts have sheep. Sheep are just as valuable in producing points as cows and processed goods, but remember, they cost 1 point less. This way of determining the best contracts is misleading though. The reality is that situational exceptions make a huge difference in determining what is the best contract. For example, it is all well and good to say slaughtering sheep is the best way to get contract points, until you realize that you may also lose your settlement points in doing so. Therefore, I want to spend some time discussing what are some of these situational exceptions and what kind of impact they have. Earlier in the video, we saw one example of a situational exception where the animal port can make some contracts more valuable at the beginning of the game. The basic and processed good ports are 2 other ports that can influence value in round 1. Usually, these 3 ports have all been used by the time round 5 rolls around, so we can dismiss their effects for contract values in round 5. The other big situational factors to consider are settlements, the final point values for cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, and the glory tiles. As has already been mentioned, slaughtering animals to complete contracts may also mean losing 6 or even 12 points due to no longer having the largest settlement. As for the final export goods, point values are straightforward. When cotton is worth 5 points, it makes all cotton contracts significantly more valuable than when it is at 3 points. The effect of glory tiles is much more variable, as depending on the round 5 glory tile, some contract values may get more affected than others. Some glory tiles increase the value of contracts, while others decrease the value. Actually, the 5-6 bound glory tile can even affect contracts in both directions. Using the 3 sheep 2 bread contract as an example, let's look at how glory tiles affect the point value of the contract. If the slaughtered animal glory tile is showing, then the contract's worth 6 extra points. The export goods tile causes the contract to be worth an extra 4 points. On the downside, if the processed goods glory tile is up, then the contract is worth 3 points less, since 2 bread are used to complete the contract, while the basic goods glory tile would also result in 3 points less, since 3 wool will not get produced. To illustrate how much the contract values can vary, let's look at some examples in this next table. It shows the difference in net points between the highest and lowest possible net points achievable for a contract. The 4 cheese contract can be worth as many as 16 net points if cotton is worth 5 points and the export goods glory tile is showing around 5. Unfortunately, if cotton is only worth 3 points and the processed goods glory tile is up in round 5, you will actually lose points by completing the contract. Well, at least you'll get some nice monetary rewards. The 4 cheese contract is the contract that loses the most net points out of all contracts, but there are actually 8 contracts where you will lose points in the minimum condition, and one of them doesn't even give any monetary rewards. A difference of 18 points between the maximum and minimum net points is also not an anomaly. The 4 whiskey contract and the 1 bread 3 cheese contract are 2 others, but there are actually 7 contracts whose difference is 18 net points. Incredibly, 20 out of the 50 contracts have a difference of at least 15 points between the maximum and minimum net points. Even the always sought after 1 sheep 1 cheese contract can be worth only 1.5 net points if cotton is worth 3 points and the processed goods glory tile is showing around 5. And coming back to possibly the best late game contract of them all, the 3 sheep 2 bread contract has the highest possible net point value of all contracts if the animal slaughter glory tile is up and tobacco is worth 5 points. But even this contract suffers greatly in the minimum condition. While I focused on situational exceptions for round 5 contracts, the reality is that you want to pay attention to these factors across all rounds when choosing contracts. For example, if the animal slaughter glory tile is up in an early round, that makes animal contracts more valuable early in the game compared to later in the game. Choosing the best contract at the beginning of the game is easier than at the end of the game, but I would say that the main takeaway is to think about what the value of the contract is. Early in the game, you're looking for monetary rewards, while late in the game, you're looking for point rewards. Early in the game, it can be hard to know which export good will be worth 5 points, so often it is best to simply get a balance across each of the 3 goods, and then you don't need to worry about it. And pay attention to the round 5 glory tile. Well, that's it for contracts. I hope this video was informative in helping you think about which contracts to take in your next game of Clans of Caledonia.